Hello and welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded Oxford Clay, an eco-conscious pottery company. So on this podcast, we're going to be talking about all things pottery related, often with an eco-conscious twist, and I can't wait to share it with you. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about making your own pottery glazes. So you might be, doing pottery in a kind of community pottery or educational setting, and they might let you, make your own glaze and then bring it in, or they might let you, use the materials there to make your own glaze. Or if you're practicing pottery at home, you have your own kiln, the world's your oyster in terms of making your own glazes. It's really exciting. So you may not have ever made your own glaze before. You might think it's really tricky. You might use, ones that you buy as a powder that's already mixed, or you might buy a liquid glaze that's already mixed and use that. But I just want to tell you, you absolutely can make your own glazes. It's very simple, and you basically follow a recipe, a bit like making a cake. And it makes the glaze. So before I started making my own glazes, I thought it was really, really complicated. And I thought, oh no, I'll never be able to do that. Maybe I'll need a degree in chemistry or something to be able to do it. But that is absolutely not the case. It's often using very simple ingredients. They're all kind of very, quite often like the same ingredients you're using every time, or and you're changing the colorant, or you're just, tweaking certain things. You're maybe changing the type of plant ash you're using every time or something. So it's very simple, and I'm going to talk you through the process today, just to kind of just so you know that and then maybe at the end you'll be like, I can do this too. I can make a glaze. So and if you do make your own glazes, sometimes it's just interesting, isn't it, hearing about how other people make their do their pottery and stuff. Sometimes I love hearing about how other people's pottery processes happen. I'm just it kind of gives me ideas and stuff, oh, maybe I could do that. And when you're dealing with powders in glaze making, you always want to make sure that you've got an FFP3 face mask as well. So you need to wear one of those whenever you're working with any fine powders in glaze making, or you're working with any plant ash. You don't want to be breathing in those powders. So it's really important to say that first in terms of safety. Okay, so the first thing to say is that you need to know whether your clay is earthenware or stoneware. So that's effectively, are you making a low fire glaze or are you making a high fire glaze? So if you've got stoneware clay, you need to be making a high fire glaze. And if you've got earthenware clay, you need to be making a low fire or mid fire glaze. And then that will fit the type of clay you're using. So it also means that the glaze is fired to the right temperature. Okay, so all the glazes I make are stoneware, because I fire all my pottery to stoneware temperatures in my kiln. So it's 1280, and all the glazes I make, they reach maturity at that temperature. So okay, so just to say that if you're looking for recipes, I've done a whole other episode actually on where to find glaze recipes, then you need to be picking ones that are right for your clay. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. Okay, so the second thing to say is get a glaze recipe. So like I said, I've done this in a whole other episode. There's loads of different sources of recipes, but generally say books are a fantastic source of glaze recipes. There's some incredible books out there. I've got lots out the library actually. Your local library might have some, that you can buy some online, or if you want some glaze recipes, I've got lots actually in my books. There's one on ash glazing, pottery glazing with plant ash. That's got a glaze recipe in. That's just one glaze recipe. And then Eco-conscious pottery glazing also has 17 glaze recipes in as well. So if you want some glaze recipes, there's those resources, but there's so many books out there, and you can even find recipes sort of like online as well. Okay, so you've got your recipe, you've got your glaze recipe, and the way you read a glaze recipe is as follows. Okay, so the basic ingredients of a glaze usually will add up to 100 parts. So often this won't include any colorants and it won't include any water. So those two elements are added on top of your base glaze recipe. So for example, in this book that I wrote on plant ash glazing, so pottery glazing with plant ash, the recipe I used was 40 parts Cornish stone, 20 parts quartz, ground quartz, and then 40 parts plant ash. So those three ingredients together made up 100 parts. So if you're, for example, making, 100 grams of glaze, which is very small, let's say a kilogram of glaze, you need to be dividing those ingredients up into parts. So like the proportion, for example. So like your quartz, for example, if you're making a kilogram of glaze, your quartz will be like 200 grams, and then the Cornish stone is going to be 400 grams, and then the plant ash is also going to be 400 grams, and then together, I think, they add up to a kilogram. Yeah. So, so what you need to do is basically, the parts you need to kind of transfer into weight. So it's always generally measured in weight. So I just use normal kitchen scales, and I just weigh it out in like a mixing bowl that I bought from the supermarket, and just kind of the ingredients will already come in powdered form from the pottery supplier. Apart from ash, if you're using an ash, you'll need to like just process that yourself by sieving it. Some people wash it, but that's a whole nother story. I don't bother washing it, I just sieve it. And then that gives you all your dry powders, and that gives you 100 parts. Okay, so the next thing that you might be doing is you might be adding a colorant on top. So I actually don't add any metal oxides on top, for my pottery glazing. I actually paint on with recycled metal oxides, which I make from recycled copper metal and recycled iron. I can make one as well from. But you might be using a commercial metal oxide, and those are always measured on top of your base recipe. So say you've got your 100 parts of a kilogram of glaze, you've got that, put it in a bucket, all your dry ingredients, that's great, put them in a bucket with a lid, get a bucket with a lid, and then you can weigh out your metal oxide on top of your 100 parts. So for example, quite a lot of metal oxides will be like maybe 1%, 2%, maybe up to 4%, 5%, occasionally a little bit more than that, because they're very strong colorants normally. So you only generally need 1 to 2%, but in your glazing recipe, it will specify how many parts basically of a colorant you need to add. So say for example you're making a glaze with iron oxide, and it says 5 of iron oxide, then in your we're making our glaze of a kilogram, so 5 would be 50 grams of iron oxide. So that's 5% of our 1,000 grams of the other ingredients, but we're adding it on top. Okay, so right, so then you add the colorant in, and then you just add the water, and that is it. That's how you make a glaze. You're literally just measuring out the dry ingredients, putting it in a bucket, and just adding some water. Okay, so get some water, start adding it in, give it a stir, and you're aiming for the consistency, try and make sure there's no lumps in there, just keep on stirring it. You're aiming for the consistency of kind of like a single cream. Some ash glazes like to be a bit like thicker, ever so slightly thicker. They just work better if they're just like a little bit applied, a little bit thicker. But generally, like, you know, if you're making a glaze from like powdered rocks, you know, quartz, dolomite, etc., flint, you know, those kind of things, like ball clay, china clay, those kind of glazes can, you know, they go on really well at a consistency of like single cream. So give it a really good mix. Some glazes like settle to the bottom very quickly, so it's a great idea to give it a whisk with one of those like hand blenders. I sometimes use an electric hand blender, and they're really, really good for getting a really, really smooth glaze. Or you can just stir it with a spoon, you know. Generally, like it's not good to like touch the glaze with your hand in case, you know, just because they've got like metal oxides in there maybe, or you know, it might like irritate your skin. So generally just use like a stirring stick or a spoon, and just keep on stirring your glaze until it's smooth and until it's got no lumps. And then what lots of potters do is they will then sieve their glaze, and that really helps to like disperse like any like oxide particles. It really just helps to like disperse it all, any lumps, get rid of those, you know. It helps to like make the glaze like really, really smooth, like, you know, just get out any kind of any impurities and just really mix the glaze really well. So you can get special glaze sieves from pottery suppliers. They're very, very fine mesh. And when you pour the glaze through it, you know, you might need to have like a spatula or something just to push the glaze through it. And that's how, you know, you basically sieve your glaze. And generally glazes just need to be sieved once. You know, once you've mixed them all up, you sieve them back into their bucket, and then that's done. You've actually made a glaze. So that's it. You've made a glaze. That's like all you need to do. So another top tip I would say actually just at the end is to make sure you kind of like label your glaze. So there have been times when I've made a glaze and I've been like, oh, which bucket was it in? And so what I do now is I always make sure I like write the glaze on the lid. And then I know exactly, like, especially if I'm actually doing loads of different plant ash glazes, that can get a bit confusing because they all look right the same. And then I always make sure I label the glaze as soon as I've made it, and then I won't like forget what it is. So yeah, label the lid, keep the lid on to keep the kind of level of water in. And then when you come to use your glaze, just give it a stir, make sure it's really smooth again, all mixed up properly. You can dip your pot in it then. And then replace the lid every time, just to keep the water in. If the glaze starts getting a bit thick, so, you know, if you're dipping lots of pots in it, it will absorb the water, and, you know, and also water's evaporating, can get a bit thicker. So once you've given it a stir, if it feels a bit thick, you think, oh no, maybe it's a bit thick, you can add just a little bit more water in every time, you know, and just mix it up again, and then it gets back to the right consistency. So yeah, another thing to say actually is if you accidentally add too much water at the glaze making stage, that is absolutely fine and is not a disaster, and it happens all the time, and it's almost like the only way you can really, you know, tell like how much water to add is like accidentally adding too much one day or whatever. So you just wait for all the ingredients to settle at the bottom, and then you'll get like a pure kind of water on top, and literally you can just scoop it off. So it's really not a disaster. It's very easy to fix. Scoop off the water as soon as all the ingredients have settled, mix it up again, then see, you know, how thick is my glaze now. If it's a bit too thick, add a bit more water. If it's still too thin, you think, oh, maybe it's a bit thin, then you can, you know, do the same process again, let everything settle again, and then scrape off, you know, just scoop off a little bit more water. And sometimes the only way really to tell how thick to make a glaze is if you dip a pot in it and fire it. And if it's like, you know, oh, I think it's a bit thin, it doesn't look quite, you know, it doesn't look very nice, like it's very like, you know, it's matte or too translucent, you think, oh, maybe it's not been applied thick enough. Or if you've accidentally applied it, you know, if you realise your glaze is actually too thick, if it's kind of running down the pot in big gloops and you know, like sticking to the kiln shelf or something. Some glazes, you know, if they're applied too thickly, they just run terribly, like, or, you know, or drip and stuff like that. So the only way you can tell is sometimes just to fire a pot, you know. So so it's all about like experimentation. Another thing to say is that some glaze making materials will actually make a glaze run more, you know, so it depends on like the kind of oxides you've added and like what your glaze is made out of. Some ash glazes run quite badly, so you know, it really just is about like experimenting, like how thick do I need to make this glaze to make the kind of the look I want basically on my pot. Yes, I think that's it. Just looking at my notes, yeah, we've covered everything. So that is how to make your own glaze. It's actually very simple. It basically involves weighing out the ingredients of, you know, up to 100 parts. I have actually, just to say, I have actually seen some glazes which don't add up to 100, but just always follow the parts. So if it's saying, you know, if the parts add up to 120 or something, just follow the parts, because the person who's made the recipe will know exactly how many parts you need for that recipe. So yeah, it doesn't have to add up to 100. I've seen ones that don't, but generally speaking, it'll be 100 parts. And yeah, just weigh it out with scales, you know, convert the parts into weight, however much you're making. If you're just making a little test, you might just need 100 grams in total. Yeah, and enjoy. There's like a whole world of experimentation that's like, you know, available to you once you start sort of like making your own glazes. It's like, yeah, I found it hard to stop actually. I'm a bit like, I just want to make loads and loads. Every plant I see, I want to make it into a glaze. So yeah, plant ash glazing is a whole world of cool world of fun. So yeah, so I hope you found this episode helpful. And if you think, oh, I can't make a glaze, that is not true. You can make a glaze, and it's something you can absolutely try. So yeah, so thanks so much for joining me on this episode, and I'll see you next time. Happy potting. So if you liked that and you're interested in learning more about pottery, eco-conscious pottery, tools and techniques for potters, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's blogs, ebooks, e-courses, video courses, and I can't wait to see you there. So the website is www.oxfordclay.co.uk.